The year is 1927. The Roaring Twenties are in full swing. A new form of entertainment is sweeping the nation, motion pictures with synchronized sound. The Jazz Singer, largely a silent film with a few musical numbers and spoken lines, has just premiered. It captivated audiences. It signaled the dawn of the talkie era. Hollywood stood on the cusp of an explosion of innovation and cultural dominance. It was poised to shape global entertainment for the next century. But imagine a different path. What if the technological leap to synchronized sound proved insurmountable for a crucial decade or more? Early sound technology was too cumbersome. It was unreliable. Or it was simply too expensive for widespread adoption. Audio quality remained consistently poor. Dialogue was unintelligible. Music was grating. Logistical challenges of recording, editing, and projecting sound films were immense. They simply bankrupted pioneering studios. The industry dismissed sound as a fleeting novelty. All efforts focused instead on perfecting silent storytelling. Silent films dominated cinema until the late 1930s, or even well into the 1940s. This divergence profoundly shifted cinematic artistry. Silent films, pushed to their creative limits by the absence of dialogue, evolved into sophisticated forms. Directors became undisputed masters of visual storytelling. They honed their craft. They conveyed complex emotions, intricate plots, and nuanced character arcs solely through imagery. They relied on exaggerated yet precise expressions, meticulously planned cinematography, and evocative orchestral scores performed live in theaters. These scores became an indispensable part of the cinematic experience, tailored to each screening's specific pacing and mood. The intertitle transformed. Far from a mere placeholder for dialogue, it became a highly refined artistic element. Intertitles became works of art themselves. They featured dynamic typography, elaborate visual flair, and subtle animation. They bordered on kinetic sculpture. They enhanced the narrative rather than merely stating it. They conveyed dialogue and plot points. They also contributed to the film's overall aesthetic and emotional resonance. They often employed visual metaphors to deepen meaning. This prolonged silent era fostered entirely new genres born from visual necessity. These genres pushed the boundaries of what a nonverbal medium could achieve. Kinetic horror emerged as a distinct and terrifying force. Filmmakers relied on disorienting camera movements, unsettling visual effects, abstract shadows, rapid-fire cutting, and complete mastery of body language. They conveyed dread and terror through these means. A lingering shot of a distorted reflection, a sudden, unnatural twitch in an actor's movement, or terrifying silence punctuated by a live, discordant orchestra became more effective than any scream or spoken threat. Fear resided in what was seen and felt, not heard. Visual ballets and choreographic comedies evolved beyond mere slapstick. Think of highly stylized, dance-like physical performances. Humor arose from intricate choreographies of movement, perfectly timed visual gags, and character interactions expressed through precise, often exaggerated, bodily language. These were less about funny situations and more about the beauty and absurdity of human motion. Immersive visual essays transformed documentaries. Unburdened by narration, these became rich, immersive experiences. Filmmakers employed elaborate set pieces, symbolic imagery, and highly suggestive montage. They conveyed complex information, scientific principles, or historical narratives visually. Audiences interpreted, deduced, and understood through observation and visual association. This made the viewing experience more active and intellectual. Finally, pure cinema and abstract narratives might see the birth of a movement foregrounding abstract visual experiences over linear narratives, akin to visual poetry. These films explored themes, emotions, or philosophical concepts through sequences of light, shadow, form, and motion. They relied entirely on the audience's emotional and intellectual response to the visual symphony. Filmmakers pioneered revolutionary shooting techniques to compensate for the lack of sound. We might see the invention of incredibly complex lighting systems. These involved intricate mirror arrays, precisely controlled shutters, and early forms of projected backgrounds. They created dynamic, mood-altering environments. They spoke volumes without a single word. Entire emotional arcs could be conveyed purely through the shifting interplay of light and shadow on an actor's face or a set. Advanced in-camera animation or miniature work seamlessly integrated with live-action footage. This allowed for fantastical elements to feel tangible. Magical realism flourished visually. New types of specialized cameras might be developed, ones designed for extreme close-ups capturing every nuanced facial muscle and flicker of an eye, or cameras mounted on elaborate rigs allowing for highly stylized, dance-like movements. These underscored character emotion or narrative tension. Silent film became a masterclass in dynamic visual composition. Acting styles underwent a radical transformation. They moved beyond traditional pantomime into sophisticated new forms of physical expression and exaggerated realism. Performers developed an entire vocabulary of nuanced gestures, subtle facial tremors, and expressive bodily language. An emotive dance style might emerge. Actors conveyed deep psychological states and complex motivations through precise, symbolic body movements. The art of the silent scream, delivered purely through contorted facial expressions, taut body tension, and a powerfully rising, discordant live orchestral crescendo, became an iconic, unforgettable cinematic moment, arguably more chilling than any audible shriek. Actors whose voices were unsuited for sound films, or who relied heavily on physical comedy and nuanced pantomime, like Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, and Mary Pickford, not only retained but greatly amplified their superstardom. Emphasis remained squarely on expressive physicality and universal visual appeal. This made international distribution inherently easier without language barriers. It solidified Hollywood's strong global reach. Film stars were recognized by their faces and movements alone. They transcended linguistic divides effortlessly. Their silent charisma was their passport to global adoration. The music industry transformed profoundly. Live orchestral performances in movie theaters continued to thrive and diversify. They became integral parts of the cinematic experience. Theater orchestras didn't just play existing compositions. They employed dedicated musicians and conductors specializing in film accompaniment. They developed sophisticated techniques for improvisation and adapting scores on the fly. They reacted to audience energy and specific directors' notes. Composers dedicated entire careers to creating dynamic, adaptable scores specifically for films. This led to a flourishing of original orchestral, experimental, and jazz-infused cinematic music. The transition to recorded soundtracks was significantly delayed. This changed the development of popular music and how it reached audiences. Recorded music found its primary home in radio and personal phonographs for much longer. Film music remained a predominantly live, collaborative, and geographically diverse art form. This fostered a stronger appreciation for live performance across all musical genres. Culturally, the absence of widespread talkies had subtle but significant effects on daily life. Cultural assimilation, particularly for immigrant populations, might be slower. There was no pervasive influence of spoken English in popular entertainment. New Americans relied more heavily on community interactions, schools, and radio for linguistic immersion. This led to stronger retention of regional accents and dialects across the nation, fostering a more diverse linguistic landscape. Foreign language films retained more prominence in American cinemas. They didn't face the same language barrier as talkies. The sound of American life was different. It was less defined by catchy movie tunes hummed in the streets. It was more defined by radio broadcasts, live music performances echoing from dance halls and clubs, and the natural, unamplified rhythms of daily life. The public soundscape was richer in live acoustic events and local variations. The development of other forms of entertainment, like radio, accelerated. They filled the void of spoken narratives that cinema couldn't provide. Radio plays, serialized dramas, and news broadcasts became even more central to information and entertainment consumption in American homes. They reached unprecedented levels of sophistication and popularity. Radio actors became the true vocal stars. Their voices were as recognizable and beloved as film stars' faces. This created a parallel galaxy of celebrity based purely on auditory presence. When television eventually arrived, likely in the late 1940s or early 1950s, in this timeline, it faced a less verbally sophisticated cinematic landscape. This forced it to develop its own unique visual and narrative language. Television leaned heavily into live performance, theatrical staging, and visual spectacle. It didn't simply mimic sound films. Early TV was dominated by visually elaborate variety shows, visual radio plays, and experimental artistic programming. It pushed the boundaries of what could be done with a small screen and a limited budget. It fostered a greater appreciation for direct, unmediated visual events. Even politics and propaganda adapted significantly to this visual-first world. Without the ability to deliver rousing speeches through film, political messages conveyed through powerful visual metaphors and symbolism. Newsreels evolved into highly stylized allegories. They used animation, dramatic lighting, and symbolic character types. They communicated political stances, condemned opposing ideologies, or rallied public support. The visual language of political cinema became incredibly sophisticated. It conveyed complex ideas through montage and imagery. Interactive elements with live audiences, like staged theatrical reactions or call-and-response segments integrated into political film screenings, became common. They blended cinema with live political rally. Political cinema was more about emotional impact and symbolic resonance than direct argumentation. It fostered a population more attuned to visual cues and less to rhetoric. In education, silent films became a primary teaching tool. Their universal visual language was key. Complex scientific concepts were explained through elaborate animated sequences. Historical events were recreated with meticulous visual precision. Ethical dilemmas were explored through symbolic narratives and character actions. This visual-first approach fundamentally reshaped pedagogical methods. It emphasized observation, interpretation, and visual literacy from an early age. Imagine classrooms where history lessons were taught through compelling silent dramas, or scientific principles illustrated by intricate, wordless cinematic demonstrations. These relied on sophisticated visual analogies. This led to a population with highly developed visual reasoning skills. Regarding globalization, the inherent universality of silent film initially propelled international distribution. A longer silent era led to fascinating cultural divergence. Some visual narratives became truly universal. They transcended borders with ease. Yet, different countries also developed their own unique visual languages. These were distinctive cinematic styles, symbolic gestures, and narrative conventions. They reflected specific cultural nuances and historical contexts. This created a richer, more diverse global cinematic tapestry. Films from different nations were understood by their unique visual grammar, not translated dialogue. This fostered deeper cross-cultural appreciation for varied forms of silent expression. It potentially led to less cultural homogenization in entertainment. Festivals celebrated films from diverse regions for their unique visual identities. The economy of filmmaking was fundamentally altered. The absence of expensive sound recording and playback equipment lowered entry barriers for independent filmmakers. This led to an explosion of diverse voices and experimental cinema movements outside the Hollywood studio system. It decentralized film production. It fostered regional cinematic identities globally. Studios invested more heavily in visual spectacle, elaborate set design, complex practical effects, and massive live orchestras. They didn't prioritize sound stages and voice actors. This also kept more jobs within local communities, particularly for musicians and stagehands. The experience of moviegoing itself remained a communal, dynamic event. The live orchestra was not merely background music. It was an active participant. Its performance fluctuated with audience reactions and the specific screening. Audiences became more vocal. Their reactions, laughter, gasps, murmurs, formed part of the shared, spontaneous soundscape of the cinema. Movie palaces became more opulent. They were acoustically designed to enhance live musical accompaniment. Film screenings transformed into grand, multisensory spectacles. The audience was an active, participating element, not just a passive consumer. The extended dominance of silent film had ripple effects on technologies far beyond the silver screen. The absence of strong demand for high-fidelity, synchronized audio in cinema slowed the general development of audio recording and amplification technologies. Radio still drove advancements in broadcasting and home listening. However, the intense pressure for perfect audio synchronization in film, which in our timeline pushed breakthroughs in microphones, speakers, and recording mediums, was absent. This meant that when recorded music or broadcast radio eventually reached peak fidelity, it did so later, or through different technological pathways. Instead of sound, focus shifted to visual fidelity and immersion. We saw accelerated development in large-format film stocks, like IMAX precursors. Even early experiments with 3D technology, beyond simple stereoscopic cards, enhanced the visual experience. Projector technology became incredibly advanced. It focused on brightness, clarity, and the ability to handle vast, detailed images. The pursuit of purely visual spectacle led to innovations in screen size, curvature, and even interactive light displays within the theater. These further enhanced the silent spectacle. The architectural design of movie palaces evolved differently. No need for soundproofing between auditoriums. No need for precisely calibrated acoustics for dialogue. Focus instead went to optimizing sightlines. It enhanced the visual grandeur of the space. It incorporated more elaborate mechanisms for live musical performance. Orchestral pits became larger and more central. Complex lighting rigs integrated into theater ceilings. This allowed for a more dynamic interplay between the film and the live performance. Some theaters even incorporated subtle scent dispersal systems, engaging another sense to deepen immersion. Language itself subtly shifted. Without the pervasive influence of movie dialogue standardizing slang and accents, regional idioms persisted longer and were more distinct. New forms of visual communication emerged in everyday life. They were influenced by cinematic gestures or symbolic imagery. Certain hand signals or body language conventions, derived from popular silent films, became common shorthand in everyday interactions. Journalism and film criticism operated under different paradigms. Film reviews focused almost entirely on cinematography, acting, directing, editing, and the effectiveness of the score. Critics became experts in visual grammar. They interpreted symbolic elements. They dissected the emotional impact of a scene without reliance on dialogue. Film theory developed unique frameworks for analyzing nonverbal narrative. This created a deeper, more sophisticated understanding of visual rhetoric. Academic departments specialized in visual semiotics rather than film studies as we know it. The star system's longevity was notable. Careers of silent-era stars, whose appeal transcended language, were far more extended. Their iconic images and distinctive physical performances continued to captivate audiences for decades. This made the transition to spoken film, if it ever came, even more disruptive. Beloved figures might suddenly be deemed unsuitable due to their voices. This led to greater resistance from audiences. The Itaki crash for some actors was even more dramatic. The economic structure of Hollywood was impacted. Without massive investment in sound technology and sound stages, studios had more capital for production design, elaborate costumes, massive sets, and complex practical effects. This led to a golden age of visually extravagant films, even more so than in our timeline. The division of labor was different. Sound engineers, boom operators, and voice coaches didn't exist as major professions until much later. Instead, demand for set designers, lighting technicians, choreographers, and highly skilled musicians skyrocketed. This fostered stronger, more specialized guilds for these visual and musical artisans. The role of international co-productions also saw a boost. No language barrier to overcome. Studios more easily collaborated across national borders. They shared talent and resources purely on visual style and artistic compatibility. This led to a more interconnected global film industry earlier on. It fostered a truly international cinematic aesthetic alongside distinct national visual languages. The power of mime and physical theater experienced a resurgence. With cinema's emphasis on visual storytelling, stage productions followed suit. Mime artists and physical comedians gained greater prominence. They developed more complex, nuanced forms of nonverbal performance. This cross-pollination between film and live theater created a richer landscape for performance arts. The psychological impact on audiences was distinct. Silent films demanded more active engagement from the viewer. They had to interpret emotions, infer dialogue, and fill in sensory gaps. This led to a more visually literate and imaginatively engaged populace. The act of reading a film was a more personal and interactive experience. It fostered stronger emotional connections with characters and narratives through shared interpretation. Beyond entertainment and culture, the absence of talkies subtly influenced broader societal development. The emphasis on visual communication fostered a more observational and less vocal culture. People became more adept at reading body language, facial expressions, and visual cues in daily interactions. This led to a slight shift in social norms. Direct verbal confrontation was less common. It was replaced by more subtle, nonverbal negotiations. The very concept of narrative and storytelling evolved. With visual primacy, stories became more symbolic, allegorical, and open to individual interpretation. Films relied less on explicit exposition. They focused more on creating an atmosphere or conveying a feeling. This left greater room for ambiguity and personal meaning-making. It trickled down into literature and other art forms. It encouraged more visually descriptive writing and less dialogue-driven plays. The development of mass communication and public discourse relied heavily on visual mediums. Public service announcements, news segments, and educational content were crafted with intense focus on impactful imagery and universal symbols. The use of visually striking posters, synchronized visual parades, and symbolic public art became even more sophisticated tools for conveying information and shaping public opinion. Political rallies integrated large-scale silent film projections. These complemented live performances. They created powerful, immersive experiences without a single spoken word from the screen. The concept of celebrity was truly global. A silent film star's charisma and persona were universally understood. This fostered a stronger sense of shared global popular culture. Movie idols were recognized and adored across continents without the barrier of language. International tours by these stars were even more impactful. Their performances required no translation. This alternate world valued visual literacy above all. Schools dedicated more time to teaching visual analysis, understanding symbolism, and interpreting nonverbal cues. This foundational shift in education created a populace profoundly attuned to visual narratives, capable of discerning complex meanings from images alone. This might have implications for fields like advertising, urban planning, and even scientific communication, where visual clarity would become paramount. The development of censorship might also take a different path. Without spoken dialogue, it would be harder to pinpoint explicit verbal transgressions. Censors would instead focus on visual suggestions, symbolism, and physical gestures. This could lead to a more abstract, perhaps even more oppressive, form of visual control, where subtle visual cues could be deemed subversive. Conversely, it might foster more clever, indirect forms of visual protest and artistic rebellion. This alternate history raises a crucial question: when, if ever, would sound truly break through? If technological and economic barriers remained high, it might not be until the 1940s or even 1950s that synchronized sound became viable and widespread. By then, silent cinema would have reached incredible artistic maturity. It might even have developed technologies like on-screen text projection that adapts to different languages for wider global distribution. When sound does eventually arrive, the impact would be profound and traumatic. It wouldn't be a gradual transition. It would be a sudden, jarring shift for an industry that perfected silence. Immense resistance from silent film purists would emerge. Critics, directors, and audiences would see spoken dialogue as a crude, unnecessary intrusion. It would cheapen the visual art. This could lead to a longer period where both silent and sound films coexisted. Each would have its dedicated audience. Sound might take over definitively only much later. Initial talkies would feel rudimentary. They would greatly contrast with sophisticated silent films. The transition would be a de-evolution in visual artistry in many ways. Directors and actors would struggle to incorporate dialogue. They would risk sacrificing the rich visual language they perfected over decades. It would be a new challenge: integrate sound seamlessly rather than letting it dominate. A golden age of silent cinema would be a long, cherished memory. It would be a testament to what an art form could achieve when forced to rely on its fundamental elements. Artistic compromises in the early sound era, static cameras, theatrical acting, would be magnified. This would lead to a period of visually less dynamic films while the industry grappled with new audio technology. Perhaps, in this reality, a niche but highly respected art house's circuit for silent films would persist indefinitely. It would be akin to classical music concerts. This enduring appreciation for visual storytelling would ensure the legacy of these masters is never truly lost. It would provide a counterpoint to the eventual dominance of sound. Some directors might even make a conscious choice to continue making silent films. They would elevate them to a high art form. They would be appreciated for their unique aesthetic and interpretive freedom. This could lead to a permanent bifurcation of cinematic expression: silent cinema for grand visual narratives and emotional depth, and sound cinema for more realistic, dialogue-driven stories. In this alternate world, cinema remains a largely visual art form for decades longer. Here, the power of expression comes not from spoken words. It comes from the universal language of image, music, and performance. The silver screen tells its stories in silence, leaving more to the imagination. This shapes a subtly different American culture, and indeed, a subtly different world. It makes us realize how deeply sound altered our reality. It allows us to imagine the grandeur of a silent cinema that truly blossomed in its absence.